Okay, the first thing we want to do when we're working with beams in ARCHICAD 12 is to get familiar with the beam default settings dialog box, which can be opened by double clicking on the beam tool. In the first drop down box we've got the beam height, and the beam height, like the slab, is measured from the top down as opposed to the walls, which when we put a height in for, say, the walls, it's measured from the bottom up. This box here gives us the relative height, and this box here gives us the absolute height, or the height from project 0. These two icons here give us an option to choose between just the plain rectangular beam, which was available to us in earlier versions of ARCHICAD, and then in the latest versions of ARCHICAD we've got the option of having a profile beam. With the profile beam, we can go into the profile manager and we can pretty much create any kind of a profile for a beam that we want. That beam can be used as a beam, or it can be used as a baseboard, or a crown molding, or a chair rail, or any other horizontal profile that we want to stretch out. This box here will give us the width of the beam, and here we can determine the reference axis offset. This box can give us a rotated beam, and here we can choose from either horizontal or inclined. If we take the incline tool here, we can put a slant angle on the beam. In the floor plan and section area here, we can choose how to show the beam, whether it be on the home story only, home and 1 story up, home and 1 story down, home and 1 story up and down, all stories, or all relevant stories. We can also choose to show this as projected with overhead, or cut only. And if you go into the cut plane lesson, you'll get a better explanation of that. Under structure, with the complex profile selected, this button will come up, and here we can choose from some of the complex profiles that we've stored, or we can go into the create profile and create our own. Here we have our beam priority, which are always odd numbers: 7, 9, 11, 13. And by adjusting this, we can determine which beams cut through each other, and we'll give an explanation of this on the 3D view. As in other tools, we have the cut surfaces dialog box, and we can click here to apply the structure settings, which will override what's selected here. Same thing with the outlines. We can adjust the overhead lines, the overhead line pens, the uncut lines, the uncut line pens. Under symbols, we can select how the beam end lines look, whether we have ends on both, the start, the end, or none. We can choose to show the center line. If we choose to show the center line, then we have some additional options that show us the center line type and the center line pen. As we have a complex profile selected, we only have an option here for the color of the beam ends. If we go back to rectangular, we can choose how it looks in 3D. Top, bottom, left side, right side, and end. We can change any one of those, and with this button, linked materials, we can make all of them the same with one click. We'll unlink that and put that back to paint red. When we have a complex profile, if we want to change the look of the beam, we're going to have to go into the complex profile and edit it there. Here we can select whether we have a rectangular or circular hole, and how it looks on the floor plan. We can select the size or diameter of the hole, and also the position of the hole relative to the top of the beam. Listing and labeling, which will be discussed separately, and of course the layer that the beam is put on. Click OK. Alright, for demonstration purposes, I've laid out a series of various different beams in the 2D plan, and we'll take a look at that in the 3D. We can get there easily by right-clicking on the mouse, bringing up our context menu, and selecting Show All in 3D. I've put two beams on a separate layer. And that layer is a wireframe layer, as indicated right here. So we can see those in wireframe. And if we select a beam, click on one of the end nodes here, we'll bring up a pet palette. And in the pet palette, we have some options here for editing the beam. Our first one would be to stretch the length, and we'll Control Z to undo that. We also have an option to rotate the beam. As you can see, we can rotate that beam. We can say put in a 45-degree angle, type in 45 and click enter, or hit enter on the keyboard. And now we've got a beam rotated at 45 degrees. We can also stretch the profile of the beam horizontally, as so. Control Z. And we can also stretch the profile vertically, as so. Control Z. We can drag it horizontally, we can elevate it, We can rotate the beam, we can mirror it, and we can also multiply. I won't go through every one of those, but I'll show you how we can multiply. We can say, and we can spread those. We'll click OK. We'll zoom out a little, and we'll grab the beam, and as you see, we can multiply many copies of those with just a couple of clicks. Control Z. If we click on the center node right here, that gives us the ability here to modify the angle. We can do this either visually, or we can say type in 20 degrees and click enter. And now we've modified the angle of the beam. Once that is done, if we again click on the center of the beam, it brings up a slightly different ped palette, which also allows us to stretch the length with that fixed angle. Control Z, Control Z, and then we're back to normal. Okay, one other thing I think we should be familiar with is the beam priority and how that works. Now if we take a close look here, we've got this beam selection and that's got a beam priority of 7. Okay, and here we have what would be a say a pipe running through the beam. And that also has a 7. So with this at a 7 and that at a 7, we don't have the beam cutting through the pipe or the pipe cutting through the beam. As you can see, we can see daylight here, and the reason for that is we have set this beam at a priority of 5, and that allows this pipe to cut through that beam. Now if we were to select that pipe again, and bring that up to say an 11, now you can see that we've cut through all the beams. Now here's a wireframe view of this beam with a priority of 5, being cut through by this beam with a priority of 7, and you can see how that looks in the 3D. And so with the beam priority settings, you can get a good idea of how we can manipulate the beams to either cut or not cut through each other, and what they look like when done so. When we have the beam that we want to draw selected, say in this case a rectangular beam, if we go up here we have several different drawing methods that we can work with. These will be familiar to you from other tools which use similar methods. The first method would be just to click Start, click Finish. The second would be more like a polyline. Click Start, click Make a Change, click Make a Change, click, double click to end. Here we can draw quick rectangles, and here we can set an angle and draw out a rectangle that way. I'll select those, right click to bring up the context menu, and we can delete that. Okay, a couple of things that we can do in the 2D menu. If we select a beam, click on an edge, that'll give us an option to insert a hole in the beam. Click OK. Once those holes are placed, we can click on a node and we can drag those into different positions. We can also multiply. Say at a space of 1 foot, and spread out as many copies as we want. Select to insert a new node on the beam, and then we can adjust that accordingly, and we'll Control Z out of that. Another way we could work with beams is we can go into Objects, under Metals, Structural Metal Framing, Structural Steel Framing. We've got steel beams. We've got a variety of steel beams that we can work with. Say with this HP beam selected, the length of the beam, we can select the rotation angle, various other parameters here. If we go into HP shapes, I've got a variety of standard shapes that we can work with. Another way we can look for beams in our object selection dialog box is to go right here where it says folder view, click the drop down button, click on find library parts, enter a keyword beam, make sure this says find all file names which contain the keyword. We have some other options, but we want to find everything that contains the keyword. We'll search in all libraries and click Find. And this gives us some additional beams to work with. We have precast beams, and we can work with many different parameters to adjust the precast beams. We have a precast inverted T, precast ledger beam, precast rectangular beam, or we go here and we check I-beam section type. We have various different options we can select from here. We can go into precast inverted T-beams, and again we have various different standards that we can work with. We can select custom, and we can adjust the width on the bottom, the width on the top, the height on the top. So between working with the complex profile manager and the standard beams that we have here in ARCHICAD, a very versatile selection of beams that we can work with, which we can use to model just about anything that comes along. If we select, say, an S-beam, you can see with the cutting settings we can adjust the rotation axis along the axis or along the cross section. This can also be done up here in parameters. But we have a nice little graphical representation here of what we can do with the cutting settings. We can choose the insertion point, whether it be the top, the center, or the bottom. We can adjust the rotation angle. We can turn the cut planes on or off. With the cut planes turned on, we can, at the low end, choose the cut type, whether it's perpendicular to the axis, along the vertical axis, or along the horizontal axis. Same thing at the high end. We can choose our cutting angles. And we have a nice little diagram here to show you how that works. We can also do that. We can also do that on the model if we click OK and we place a beam. We'll zoom into it. We'll select that beam and we'll go to this little hot spot here, and if we click on that and make sure we have our stretch tool selected, we can change the cut angle.